My name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally. This particular book is international. Sometimes we're addressing books on history, so they provide some perspective on the present, or sometimes books addressing broader trend analysis developments that will have an impact on politics. So this book is written by a woman named Lila Abu-Lughod. The title of the book is called Do Muslim Women Need Saving? So joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Baley Bauer. To Baley's right is Caro Theunisz. And to Caro's right is Marina, Vela. And I wanted to read an opening quote from the book, and then we can jump into a discussion about it. The author writes, "On a bright December day in 2010, I was having tea with Zainab, a woman who lives in a village in southern Egypt. I explained that I was writing a book about how people in the West believe that Muslim women are oppressed. I asked, is the reason Islam? I stated they believe that these women are oppressed by Islam. I was surprised by Zainab's response. What? Of course not. It's the government. The government oppresses women. The government doesn't care about the people. It doesn't care that they don't have work or jobs, that prices are so high that no one can afford anything. Poverty is hard. Men suffer from it too."
In this opening, I think that they're kind of laying out the main focus of the book, that they're saying that it's a misinterpretation that people are having, that it's not Islam, that it's the culture and the government around them.
Yeah, as Baley said, this quote gives a clear view that this book will doubt the American assumption that Islam is the fault of the cause of the oppression of women in Muslim countries. We will see many different views of this assumption.
I think it's so interesting to see like how Muslim women like blame the government to be the reason that they are really oppressed and not part of the culture, because probably the Islamic culture has a part of a blame, of a fault that they are living in the way that they are living, and not also is all part of the government.
Yeah, I would say one, she's concerned about this idea of culture as a generalization, and it doesn't allow us to get down to some more specific ways of looking at something. And two, I think she's also concerned what she says American feminism has sort of created a way of simplistically looking at women around the world, and then sort of how to liberate or free them, as opposed to trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah, so the author really, she is an anthropologist. That's something that needs to be mentioned, because she really wants to avoid generalizing about cultures, because she thinks it doesn't do justice to the complexity of cultures. And she also, I feel like she has a little bit of a prejudice against the USA or American and European feminists, because they have this set view of Muslim women being oppressed by their culture, and it's hard for them to step away from that. And she wants to let them see that this is not always the matter.
As long as Caro said, like, I think they kind of admire the feminist movement in the U.S. because they got some, they push hard for the rights, and they got like some things changed. The government changed something for them. They had more equality. They had more rights in education, jobs, etc. So they kind of admire and they want to do that. But if they don't have the support of the government, they would never like got things done.
Like you said, feminists kind of jumped on the bandwagon of this in America, and this has a big part in the media. The media kind of tries to pull and search for all these stories to get Americans to believe that it is the Islam religion and not their government.
Yeah, one of the things she was responding about was the idea of the burqa. So that she says Americans unfortunately think of it as a trash bag that you're wearing. And she's saying that as a result, there's sort of a simplistic image that all you have to do is get a woman out of the burqa. And she's saying that we have to look at it in a more complex way than that. It's not always as simple as to just say you're oppressed because you're wearing a burqa.
I really think that the burqa is not like the problem, because some Americans will say that the burqa is like a domination of the men because they want like the woman like cover up and don't show like the beauty or something. But I know that it's part of a culture and it's part of the religion as well. So like if a woman wouldn't wear it, I think it's completely fine. The fact that maybe a man like says like they have to wear it for sure, like there's no other option, I think that's wrong. But if it's a part of the religion of a culture, like it's not part of their rights. They want to wear it because.
Yeah, she asks a question, is that we have to avoid the creation of something called an homogenized subcategory called Muslim women. And I think she then tries to build on that. And so as a result, she says Muslim women live on all continents. More Muslims live in South and Southeast Asia by far than live in the Middle East. Many important developments in law and culture have emerged from these regions. And so then she's trying to, again, we have this image, it's only the Middle East, but wait a minute, where are we looking elsewhere around the world? And so that issue of what is it exactly that you want and expect.
Yeah, in this part she's basically pointing out the diversity around the world, that it's not just the Middle East, that there are more that live in the South and Southeast Asia than in the Middle East. So yeah, that she's pointing out the diversity here.
Mm-hmm. What I took away from it is that she tries to emphasize how diverse Muslim women actually are, that you can just categorize them in one single category.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the thing is that not all of the Muslim women has the same thoughts or the same traditions or the same culture, because since the diversity is like a big region, so they don't even have like the same patterns. They can be like seen as a different way, but maybe they are like good and the government is not like opposing them as other countries does.
Yeah, she discusses something called Sharia or Sharia law, and that we here have sort of an image, if we hear about it or think we know about it, that there's only one way to see it. And she's saying, wait a minute, you got to stop, because that's not true. And so she's talking about a situation where there are Muslim feminists, so it's an interesting term, Muslim feminists, in Malaysia, and they call themselves the Sisters of Islam, and they're challenging a conservative interpretation of Sharia law, but they're not really looking at abandoning Sharia law. They want to change it so that you look at Sharia law or it functions in a different way.
Yeah, so what I thought was really interesting is that we usually see Islam and feminists as two opponents, and this kind of explains how Muslim women can also be feminists, because there's this example that she calls that Malaysia women they came up for gender rights when another country misinterpreted the Sharia. So there's actually not even that much opposing between gender and, between feminists and the Islam.
Mm.
It's so good to know that there's these organizations that fight for their rights, and they take the maximum profit and the maximum benefit for them, for the woman.
Yeah, this is like now the Muslim identity, and we're trying to, it's showing that abuses and infringements need to be known, but we need to know who and why, and then form effective responses to this. And one thing that the author does state is that a lot of people who criticize don't really understand or know anything about Islamic society.
Yeah, here's a quote I liked. Even if many are willing to set aside the sensationalized stories of oppression that capture media attention and contribute to the widespread sense of certainty about the direness of the situation of the Muslim woman, quote, most people still harbor a stubborn conviction that women's rights should be defined by the values of choice and freedom, and that these are deeply compromised in Muslim communities. And so again, she's critical of sort of taking a Western sort of framework and then just using it for a way to look at women in some undefinable Muslim community, which I think she's sort of feeling we think of it as the Middle East, but again, the book is opening it up to say, no, you got to look well beyond that.
So what I took away from this is that although when some women set aside their judgment that Muslim women need saving, they still have this vast set of the definition of values and choice and freedom. And they would see the Vela as a perfect example of not having a choice and not being free. So they still think that the Muslim women does not enjoy entire freedom.
Yeah, she has this thing, can dress symbolize freedom or constraint? How can we distinguish dress that is freely chosen from that which is worn out of habit, social pressure, or fashion?
Yeah, it's so hard to distinguish that, because sometimes they will be oppressed and they will say like you have to wear that, and the other times they will want to wear it. But the thing is that even the Western Europe will be more knowledge about the situation. I think more groups of women will support that situations.
Yeah, Maya Angelou wrote this memoir, and the memoir is about abuse and racism, and it says, I know why the caged bird sings. And in there, she's contrasting being this caged bird from a free individual. And so what the author's saying is it's nice for Maya Angelou, but this may be a wrong way of trying to understand how we take a look at Muslim women in that broad sense of a term.
Right, this kind of is giving is not really giving the point that they're trying to perceive. It's kind of going against them, as it is oppressing the women that are wearing the burqas or the veils, and that they are covering themselves for the males when that's really not the point. And they did say that they were like caged birds, trapped flies, and spiders in jars. I really didn't know that it went that far, so people had those interpretations.
Yeah, so Maya Angelou's song is basically the perfect representation of how Americans see Muslim women as caged birds.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this quote, and it shows sort of, I think, the religious side in a way that maybe Christians are supposed to see this. And she writes, my aunt finds comfort in her songs and takes pleasure in family, but I notice when we talk that she also finds inner peace through prayer. She struggles to read a part of the Quran every day, even though she did not have the benefit of an education that would make this easy. With her eyes bright, she tells me that in the Quran she has found marvels. She comments, you begin to be philosophical about life. You have to accept what life brings you. And so I'm reading that thing and thinking, well, isn't that something that people that say they're Christian should be supporting? Because she's using religion in a sort of inspirational and comforting way. And so my feeling is a number of people that would think of themselves as Christian wouldn't see it so, because you'd say, no, it's Muslim or the Quran.
Yeah, it's basically the same as how Catholics or Christians grasp onto their religion to deal with certain parts of life. For example, the writer's aunt, she dealt with her suffering with religion.
Yeah, the thing is that Muslims are very faithful to the religion, so they support themselves with praying and with religion because they don't have anything left. They don't even like got like a good scholar, a good like education, so they think that maybe gods are the only thing that they can believe and trust.
Yeah, she writes, I worry about the ways that representations of Muslim women's suffering and arguments about their lack of rights have been worked politically and practically, because then she goes into sort of a post-9/11 way of looking at women. In some cases, she was focusing on places like Afghanistan.
Well, one thing that the author points out is the contrast that we have between free and unfree, and that we really need to get a strong definition of the meanings of what we think freedom truly is. And then that will help us with the cases of people who are feeling oppressed or choosing or forced to do so.
There's this whole chapter that sort of addresses Afghanistan after 9/11, then the United States goes in to go after bin Laden, but in the process is also going after the Taliban. And so she was talking about a cover on Time magazine where a young woman is shown and she has her nose cut off. And so her husband either did it, I guess, punishing her, or somebody related to the husband. And then the title was, What Happens If We Leave Afghanistan? Implying that women's are going to be the first victims. And so suddenly we're now looking at this notion that we're there to somehow save women, and exactly how to save them is what, when she gets into this, there's the political and the pragmatic. What exactly does that mean? What is it you intend to do in some substantive, coherent way that will actually matter?
Yeah. When pulling out of a country, the main focus is always the women and children that are there and how they are going to be effective when the war is over. And George W. Bush even called them women of cover, which was a very controversial title to give them, and many felt uncomfortable, but others thought that it brought them great integrity to stand behind this title. To understand the 9/11 attack, many believe that to understand it, you had to start diving into Islam and understanding their culture to kind of understand why it was happening in the first place.
Yeah, the ironic thing that actually is in this story is that when this happened to this woman, is the American troops were still in the country. So what I think the author is trying to say here is how American media can exaggerate a story into turning it into a fear of Islam and into a negative view on the Islam.
And the thing, adding what just Caro said, is like if they stay there, they would be like a victim of how are they treated and how the little and low conditions they are living. But if they leave, they're going to be like a victim of a society because they are going to be blamed for what they did.
Yeah.
This girl that had her nose cut off, so she's helped by an organization called Women for Afghan Women. And so they come in with doctors and they did reconstructive surgery on her. And so then this is all backed up by an American foundation called Grossman Burn Foundation. And so a member of this organization is telling the Time magazine and supporting this idea that we're fighting to liberate women. It's like if we leave, quote unquote, a bloodbath will happen in Afghanistan. But there's an author for The Nation, weekly news magazine, and she's saying, but the Taliban aren't all that different than the Afghans that were running the country before the Taliban, and the United States was financially backing them. And so these are essentially the same men either way. So as a result, what is it that you seem to think you're going to be doing regarding women?
Yeah, the article with this woman on the front cover was really a big statement also to the fact that you can't just go into a country and try and change them, that it's not going to fix everything right then and there.
Yeah.
The sad thing here is that making this cover is like the way to let the world know what is happening, because a lot of people like they just don't know what is happening. So exposing like themselves and explaining like the situation, like make a difference, saying that's happening is like it's true and we need help.
In October of 2001, Laura Bush, who was then the First Lady, George Bush's wife, she gave this speech about how the United States was going to sort of liberate Muslim women. And so as a result, the PBS NewsHour asked the author of this book to come on to talk about this issue of liberating Muslim women. And so she writes in here, she said, the presenter from the NewsHour first contacted me in October 2001 to see if I'd be willing to provide some background for a segment on women and Islam. I asked her whether they had done segments on women of Guatemala, Ireland, Palestine, or Bosnia when the show covered wars in those countries. And so again, the notion of when you were saying, when we look at liberating women, what exactly does this mean and what exactly is going on? And so you end up creating, she was fearful, this subcategory called Muslim women, and we then create sort of a homogenized image, and somehow we're going to do something.
Yeah, this is kind of going back to the opening quote about how the women don't feel that they're oppressed by Islam, that it's the culture around them, that it's the government, that they need changes within the system for jobs and for their own rights.
What was striking for me was how everyone asked her for religion and cultural explanations for 9/11 instead of asking for historical and political explanations. This refers to how Americans look at Muslim women and the Islam.
Like there's things that they can change, they can help, but there's things that they can really not change, like the culture or the religion. So like if the government doesn't help and the people there, like the change won't be like a huge
Yeah, they're talking, another thing is like they're talking about cultural framing, and it's preventing like the explanations and the roots of the nature of their culture, and people are getting blocked by this, and they're not really diving into Islam to understand it. They're just going into the framing of everybody else and what's around them.
Yeah, and trying to give a solution like from the outside instead of being like in the inside.
She had the Laura Bush quote here. It says, because of our recent military gains in much of Afghanistan, women are no longer imprisoned in their homes. They can listen to music and teach their daughters without fear of punishment. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. And so then what she said is, this reminded her of sort of the white man's burden, how you would go into a colonial setting and try to free. And so she's quoting somebody who said, white men saving brown women from brown men. And so that concept isn't new, and this quote is addressing turn-of-the-century Egypt. And so you're looking at the notion of that isn't sort of something brand new that we just suddenly invented.
What was interesting about Laura Bush's speech was that it worked very dividing. She was really talking about an us and them, and she confused a lot of words accidentally, maybe. For example, she confused Taliban with terrorism, and in that way she kind of makes the viewers think that these two are really closely related.
I think like the thing is that there's a huge gap between what they are saying, because it's important for the campaign, for everything to say like we're gonna do that, and what really they do. There's a gap there, like where people is expecting something to happen, but it really happened.
Back to that issue of the burqa. So then she was saying Americans seem to be under the impression that when the Taliban was overthrown in Afghanistan, women would automatically take off their burqa because they saw it as a sign of oppression. And what they find out is that the Afghan women didn't get rid of their burqa. And so she's saying you got to understand the burqa predates the Taliban. It doesn't have anything to do with them, and that as a result we have to take a look at the cultural development of the burqa, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Taliban. So how do women in Afghanistan specifically look at the burqa?
Yeah, this is, I like one of the sentences she said is the Taliban did not invent the burqa, that we just wrap this in with terrorism and oppression, and we're not really looking into what the meaning is of the burqa.
There was an interesting discussion. There's an organization in Afghanistan called the Feminist Majority, and they had a campaign to stop a secret oil pipeline deal that was going on. Now, this is pre-9/11. The Taliban were working with a U.S. multinational corporation called Unocal, and backed by the U.S. Government support. And as a result, this feminist minority was able to bring this to an end. And so as a result, you ended up sort of seeing sort of an impact. And she also brings up the notion that you had an enormous amount of violations of women by the Northern Alliance that was documented by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, rapes and assaults against women. And these were organizations that are not Taliban, but U.S.-backed organizations, and we were silent on doing anything at that particular time.
Yeah, this really points out that the feminist majorities, they do have a voice. That a lot of people get the sense that they don't have a voice and that many people don't listen to them, but there is possible change, that things can get better.
We only have a few minutes left, so what do you think of this book, and do you recommend it?
I think it opens the eyes on certain things, that it gets us out of that framing of everything around us. That I think it's a good read for people to start understanding Islam, but that you should go into Islam more to get a further understanding.
It's a very interesting read because the author uses very different perspectives of the same issue, and she does not really come to an answer because of all of those different perspectives, and that can be frustrating at times because you don't know what the right answer is, because there basically is none, and that is, I think, what she's trying to show.
I 100% recommend the book because there's so much more to learn about Muslim women and the culture, and a good way to learn it is reading this book.
Yeah, I think it's a good book, readable, and it gets away from the simplicity that you might see. I know I criticize TV a lot on this show, and my criticism is that it's created that stupidity of you're going to see things in a liberal versus conservative perspective, as though the world is that simple, or screwballs that like to use the term big government and think it means something. So, you know, another way of understanding, you get into something in more depth. So thank you for joining us today.